All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our community forum today, which is called Healing from Trauma. Thank you to Integral Care and the Integral Care Foundation for sponsoring this today. My name is Laura Wilson Slocum, and I'm the Practice Administrator for Crisis Services and Justice Initiatives at Integral Care. Integral Care is the Mental Health Authority and the Intellectual and Developmental Disability Authority for Travis County. And Integral Care has been supporting people who live with mental health disorders, substance use disorders, and intellectual and developmental disabilities for over 50 years. Before we get started today, I want to again thank the Integral Care Foundation for hosting today's forum. And what the Integral Care Foundation does is they raise funds for all of Integral Care's programs and services, and all of those things provide critical tools that build health and well-being for both adults and kids in our community who are living with mental health disorders, substance use disorders, and intellectual and developmental disabilities. Today's forum is focusing on trauma, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge this very unusual, unique, and stressful time that not just our community, but our country finds itself in. Between the global pandemic of the likes that none of us have ever experienced in our lifetime, and our nation's grappling with a history of institutional racism and racial injustice, we are collectively experiencing a lot of trauma right now in our country, similar to the times that we've experienced together as a country after the September 11th attacks and Bloody Sunday, during the march from Selma to Montgomery. So what collective trauma means is it's exactly what it sounds like. It's when something so big is happening in our country that it affects all of us. And it might help to define what trauma is. A lot of people say the word trauma, and I think most of us know what it means. But to have a working definition of trauma, it's any time that an event occurs that is so overwhelming, so stressful, or even threatening that it overwhelms an individual's ability to cope with all of the skills that they have and all of the tools they know how to use. It overwhelms our ability to cope. Trauma can happen to anyone, and it affects all of us. It can, statistically, 7 out of 10 of us will experience a traumatic event, at least one, during our lifetimes, and many of us will experience more than one during our lifetimes. Trauma isn't one particular thing. It can be a particular thing. It can be a series of things. Examples of trauma include physical assault or negligence, definitely can include sexual assault, a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina. Many people would group the current pandemic in that category, although it's quite different from hurricanes or tornadoes or floods. The death of a loved one, divorce, and trauma can also occur as a result from just prolonged ongoing stress. And examples of that might include the loss of a job, which a lot of us are grappling with right now as the economic impacts of COVID start to really show itself or show themselves. Financial struggles, a serious illness, or exposure to racism. Trauma is a risk factor. The experience of trauma is a risk factor for almost all mental health disorders and substance use disorders. And I know that people on the panel are going to be talking about that today, but in particular, trauma is a significant risk factor for the development of depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, and suicide. What we hope you will leave with today is a deeper understanding of what the signs and symptoms of a trauma response look like and how varied those responses can look, ways to help yourself and ways to help others that you may be concerned about. And then we definitely want to make sure you know where you can access help if you need it. I want to start by introducing the members of our panel. I'm so excited about the panel that we have here today. I want to start with Robert Dominguez, who's a licensed professional counselor and our Associate Director for Adult Behavioral Health Service Systems at Integral Care. So Rob leads and oversees all of our integrated care clinics, as well as several teams in the community that provide a range of social supports, from housing to primary care to mental health care to case management. Rob is also a veteran, and he leads our veteran services programs. Rob both served in the Army and the Air Force, if I'm getting that right. So we're very excited to have Rob here today. He's also a therapist that has worked with many people who've experienced trauma. The next person on our panel is Erin Evans, who's also a licensed professional counselor, and she's Integral Care's program manager for mental health first aid. She previously has provided clinical services to students at the University of Texas Counseling and Mental Health Center, and I know she provided a lot of trainings to faculty and staff during her tenure there. Erin has a vested interest in what she refers to as self-compassion and mindful-based practices, and I know she's going to be talking about that today. The third member on our esteemed panel is newer to our agency, Samantha Montemayor. She joined our agency on March 9th, which is quite a time to start a new job, and we're really glad that she's here with us. Sam is also a licensed professional counselor, and she's our manager for Integral Care's mobile crisis outreach teams. Prior to Sam coming to Integral Care, she's worked in the field of crisis intervention and general mental health for over 10 years. And she currently has a private practice where she actually specializes in working with people who have survived a complex trauma. Sam has worked at our county jail, and she also was the Victim Services Director for Manor Police Department and Lago Vista Police Department. And in fact, she began the victim services programs at both those police departments. So we're very happy to have Sam join us both on this panel and at Integral Care. And to round out our panel, last but not least, we have SJ Parish joining us. And SJ is Integral Care's training supervisor for our 24/7 crisis helpline. SJ holds the belief that authentic change derives from experiencing uncomfortable situations and having the support to navigate through those uncomfortable situations. So that's who's on our panel today. And again, thank you all for joining us. I know that you're very busy. So to get our panel kicked off and started, we're going to hear from each of our panelists. They're going to give us a little intro into what they think the most important things to know about trauma are. And then we're going to move into a panel discussion, and we'll end it with a Q&A. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel, please feel free to go ahead and put those in chat. And our fabulous communications director, Ann Nagelkirk, and her colleague, Lady Jane Aqua, will be looking through all the questions and getting them ready for us at the end of the panel. We may not have time to get to all the questions. We see there's a lot of you logged on today, which we are very excited about, but we will do our best. And a final housekeeping reminder, I want to remind you all that we are recording today's forum for people who couldn't join us at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, so they can access later today. So with that, I want to start with Rob Dominguez. Rob, what do you think is the most important thing people should know about trauma?
Well, thank you so much, Laura. And again, I am just really thrilled to be able to come together and to talk about this important topic, especially where I believe it happens to be a Trauma Awareness Month. So I think, it is coming at a perfect time. I think what's really important is that we have these conversations, because often we don't talk about the worst things that have happened to us, whether it's because of feelings of shame, embarrassment, perhaps even guilt. Some may be scared that help isn't possible, thinking that no one would understand. When someone may be at the point of wanting to talk about their experience of trauma, their traumatic experience, they may not know how to have that conversation or where to reach out for help. So what we know is that the impact of trauma can be messy and it can be far-reaching. Having these type of conversations may potentially provide a guiding light for those who feel like they're wandering in the darkness of their own trauma.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think who I'd like to hear from next is Erin. What is the most important thing for you to let people know about trauma?
Thank you, Laura. And again, I also too would like to thank everyone for being here, and thank you for having me on this panel. I just want everyone to know that trauma can affect everyone differently, and we cannot predict how someone might respond to a traumatic event. So what I think is really important to remember is that those who have experienced a trauma or a traumatic event, treatment and recovery is possible. Bottom line, treatment and recovery is possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Let's hear from you, Sam. What is the most important thing you want to share about trauma?
Thank you, Laura. So the most important thing for me when I think about trauma is to think of trauma in terms of the body. It's anything that's too much, too fast, or too soon for our nervous system to handle, causing that overwhelm. Traumatic events, whether they're single or ongoing, it changes the brain. But the most important part of that is that healing changes it too. Trauma and PTSD are highly treatable with intervention, and whether that intervention is personal, communal, or therapeutic, or a mixture of the three.
Thank you so much, Sam. And, I think already we're seeing a theme that trauma, as pervasive as it is, it's very, very treatable. And there's a lot of different things that can help someone recover from trauma. SJ, I'd like to hear from you. What's the most important thing you would like the audience to know about trauma?
Thank you, Laura. Also, it's an honor to be here and just have this platform to talk about something that's very important. I'd just like to say that trauma is compounded. And when I say that, I mean it's multi-layered. Much like our lived experiences, it takes time and patience to kind of peel it back and really see it for what it is.
Thank you. It definitely does. There's not a quick fix to recovering from trauma. So I want to kick off the first question to the panel. I think I've gotten this question a lot, and it's a question I've asked before. What are just some typical ways that people respond to trauma?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start off.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think whenever an individual has experienced a traumatic event, it can come out and they can re-experience it in a number of ways. And so one of the first things is the re-experiencing of the event, and whether that's intrusive thoughts or feelings, the inability to be able to disconnect from it, right? So that they can't stop thinking about what's happened. At times that might come through in dreams, flashbacks. I also think about the way that we experience things is often through our senses. So, oftentimes we will re-experience things through our physiological, in a physiological manner, right? So a smell, a sound, those things can bring the event back up. And then I think in being mindful of our body, that might look like, inability to kind of stay still. It's a fidgeting, sweaty palms. Other ways in which individuals might respond is also persistent avoidance, or at least trying to avoid talking about the activity, talking about the event that occurred, feelings of detachment or isolation, estrangement. You know, nobody's understanding what I've gone through. Nobody will understand what I'm feeling. And then we think in terms of our kind of increased arousal, if you will. So irritability, difficulty concentrating, easily startled. You might also note, an individual might also notice that they have trouble sleeping because of the dreams that they're experiencing, the nightmares that they might be having. And especially with veterans and the work that we do with veterans, we see this hypervigilance and a heightened startle response.
While you were talking, one of the things I was wondering, and Erin, I'd like to ask you this because I know you have a clinical interest and background in kids and teens. Is what Rob talked about the same for kids as it is for adults?
Actually, what Rob is stating, humans in general experience exactly what he just listed. However, we might see it differently with children and adolescents. You know, when we're thinking of language and the development of language with children specifically, they may not have the capacity yet to talk about fear or to express verbally exactly how they're feeling. And so more so we'll see a behavior change in children who have experienced a trauma. So changes in behavior could include things like crying spells out of the blue, potential regression in development. So in terms of milestones that children might have reached, we might see that there is a change in behavior there or a regression. Definitely we can see changes in eating and sleeping. We might see unexplained anger outbursts or even aggression in ways where typically it's out of characteristic or behavior for that child. And we can see difficulty focusing in conversations with parents and guardians, or difficulty focusing on projects or even schoolwork. Sometimes with some children, we might even see a preoccupation or hyper focus on the death or separation of a parent or guardian.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know that in my personal life, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I've talked to many friends of mine who are parents. We're all just worried about our kids right now. Mm-hmm. With the combination of COVID-19 changing life as we know it, with the children seeing the racial injustice that our nation is just now starting to acknowledge in a meaningful way, and talking to our kids about that, and certainly children that are Black and children of color having to watch this, and we're all worried about our kids. So I appreciate you giving us that insight. Before I move on to the next question from SJ, Sam, anything else you would like us to know about just what's a typical response for someone experiencing trauma?
I'll expound a little bit on this one. When I think about what else to consider, I always come back to the Shilpa Jain quote, that there are libraries within and behind each of us. I don't think we can think about trauma without acknowledging intergenerational and historical trauma, whether that be racism, individual or systemic oppression, prejudice against identity, and our own personal trauma histories. SJ said something quite wonderful when Z commented about it being compounded. So that can make trauma very layered, right? It may not be one single event trauma. There's all of these things within us and behind us that influence our ability to cope and influence how somebody might be responding. And so I think what's really important for ourselves to acknowledge in our own trauma work is that we have to look at the whole story. Whether we're working with someone who's experienced trauma, we're a friend to someone who's experienced trauma, or whether we're looking at our own trauma, to really acknowledge the full story of that.
Thank you, Sam. The next question I have is a bit to piggyback off question number one, and this is also something that we hear all the time, is how does someone know if their reaction to a trauma is normal? Normal.
So again, just kind of piggybacking off of Sam, kind of doing this back and forth thing, I really appreciate it. The stories, you know, when you think about a story, you often have pieces that are unexpected that kind of unfold right before you. And I think that's a great visual in terms of trauma. We can't know how we're going to respond. And even in our response, we may be traumatized. So looking at myself kind of in the mirror, I know who I am, but in seeing how I respond to something that may, you know, in some ways sadden me or shock me. And so my ability to navigate my response is another kind of layer to that trauma. And I think there's no way to kind of normalize that except in saying that everyone responds to it in the way that they respond to it. And just being open to the reality that it's messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's definitely something that we all kind of hold in common, which connects us all in our human experience.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, it is so individualized how each person reacts to each, you know, unique trauma that they experience. And with that in mind, if we're saying that reactions to trauma are normal, which they are, and expected, which they are, when would be the times or the signs or the symptoms that a person would know, like, okay, even though this is a normal response, I need some help to navigate this?
I can speak to that one. When I think about when it gets to the point that you feel you need to reach out for help, whether I talked about those three different ones, right? Whether it's personal, communal, or therapeutic. It's whenever your normal coping skills are no longer working. We know what works for us. We can trust ourselves with that. We know when we get to a point to where we are overwhelmed and the previous coping skills that we've used are no longer either accessible or no longer effective. And so that might look like, I think SJ also spoke to this really well, that, you know, it might look like withdrawal, but you might need that withdrawal from people. You may need that as a form of being able to take care of yourself. But when it comes to a point to where you're noticing that it's affecting your daily functioning to such a degree that you're asking yourself, I don't feel like myself. I don't feel normal. This is very, very different than my baseline of when I carry stress. If you're having thoughts of suicide, you're having, you know, you're feeling overwhelmed to the point to where you're withdrawing from all the things that you used to enjoy, that you're not finding joy in those things anymore. Those would be the times where you reach out for help.
I'd like to hear from the other panelists too about what would be some other things that people should be on the lookout for, that while recognizing an abnormal or a normal response to an abnormal event is completely normal, that there are times that someone should seek help.
Sure. So I'd be happy to expand on this. So, you know, I really appreciated the way that you explained trauma at the very beginning, Laura, and you know that there's that initial physiological response of the way that we react to things, that fight, flight, or freeze response, right? But then what happens after that? And one of the things that we know is that unresolved traumatic experiences can actually stimulate or heighten future responses to events that can be, or at times it can be, that can raise our anxiety levels, if you will, right? Or things that might cause us to think back and recall that traumatic event. One of the things that we know is that trauma can also contribute to long-term physical and behavioral health, issues, right? So, and in addition, developing unhealthy habits or risk behaviors as a coping mechanism can contribute to anxiety, social isolation, and then also has an impact on our physical health, like hypertension, diabetes, cancer, for instance, even substance use disorders. One of the things that we know is that an individual who's experienced trauma may have stronger surges of like adrenaline and experience that more often than somebody who maybe hasn't had that similar experience. And really what this does is it causes wear and tear on our body, right? So I think really kind of being mindful about the way in which we're holding trauma, the way in which we respond to things, and its impact on our overall health. And while that might not be immediate, I think it's something that's really important for us to consider, for anybody to consider that has experienced a traumatic event.
Aaron or SJ, one of the things Rob brought up that I wanted to see what you two thought about it is substance use. And trauma is so related to substance use. And I'm always surprised that not a lot of people seem to know that. Could you talk about, either of you talk about why trauma and substance use are so linked together?
I can go ahead and take that, or at least a piece of it. It is, unfortunately, sometimes when people do experience a traumatic event for a lot of reasons, stigma, minimal access to healthcare, maybe someone doesn't have insurance, maybe they've never seen a therapist, so it feels scary or uncomfortable to seek out support. And as we had mentioned earlier, really what Rob expounded on in terms of the symptoms that come up when a person has experienced a traumatic event. And sometimes those things can feel unbearable. If someone is experiencing nightmares or intrusive thoughts or having this heightened sense of fear. And, sometimes people will go or lean on substances or alcohol in a way maybe they had never done before, but find that there are elements about that use that help them or eliminate or decrease some of the symptoms. And so very unintentionally, one can find themselves abusing substances or alcohol just out of means of trying to seek or trying to eliminate or decrease the symptoms they're experiencing.
I know that typically people, whether it's in response to trauma or not, they use a mood altering substance, whether that's alcohol or an illicit drug or the misuse of a prescription drug, to create feelings or to get rid of feelings. And as humans, we want to feel better when we don't feel good. And alcohol and drugs can be a quick way to achieve the things you just talked about, Aaron, with Maybe it helps you sleep. Maybe it helps you be less anxious about sleep. Maybe it improves your mood. And of course, we know the problem with that is a dependence or an abuse can develop sometimes more quickly in some people than others, and that it doesn't really address the root of the trauma. But it's certainly understandable why we turn to alcohol or drugs, because they make us feel better, right? Okay. So there's a lot of different types of trauma, and we've established that. And we've talked about some of the signs that would say, okay, this is getting to the point where I think I would benefit from some help, or I think I want to encourage my loved one to get some help. Speaking to Travis County and the Austin area, what resources are available to a person who wants to get help?
As we like to coin it here within the agency, it's kind of like the brain of the agency where people get connected. And what I'm referring to is the helpline, our crisis line, where individuals can speak to highly skilled clinicians that are thoroughly trained to be present. And as simple as that may sound, being present, being connected to someone in one of their most vulnerable states is not an easy task. So our clinicians are available to support you, to be in that moment, to help you navigate what next best steps would be. So kind of what happens from that point really depends on what it is that you feel you're needing. Is it ongoing therapy? We can connect you to kind of community resources. Is it kind of an ongoing rapport with the case manager, medication management? Maybe you feel like that's the best fit. We definitely get you connected with our appointment side of the helpline, get you connected as fast as we can with our prescribers and other skilled clinicians to get you that ongoing support. And internally within the hotline, we provide follow-up ourselves with callbacks, which is definitely an honor and a privilege to just be able to call someone and say, how are you doing? That sounds like it was really tough a few days ago. Let's talk about that. Or something, can we talk about something else that may help you get to this next step? So definitely our hotline is available, and it's just one of the resources available within the agency.
Thank you, SJ. And we're going to talk about other resources in the community, including resources that are specific. So like a resource specific to someone who has survived sexual assault, for example. But before we move away from integral care services, I wanted to ask Rob, actually you a question, and it has to do with cultural responsiveness. And as an agency, I know that that's an endeavor we've taken on in a formal way several years ago, which is how do we ensure that our agency as the Mental Health and IDD Authority of Travis County are providing services in a culturally responsive way. One of the things that Sam says that I really like is trauma, our experience of trauma is informed through our cultural lens. And there are differences between our cultures that another culture is going to miss or misinterpret. So if you could talk about cultural responsiveness and how do we make sure that we do that?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. So I think one of the things, again, that when we talk about being culturally aware and responsive, is to acknowledge that not only does everybody bring their own unique experiences of trauma, how they experience potentially mental illness or behavioral health, but they also bring their unique experiences of culture and community along with them. And so if you take me, for instance, I am a Hispanic male from Texas. I am a counselor. I'm a veteran. I'm trying to think what other categories might I belong to, right? Dallas Cowboys fans? No. But you know, if you think about, if we think about all of the different elements that make us who we are, and in the work that we do, one is to acknowledge that and then to honor that by providing care in what we coin a person-centered way and a trauma-informed way, which is to recognize that everybody brings not only their unique experiences with them, but the way in which that they've experienced it and through whatever lens that they've experienced it is unique to them. And so we very much, when we are working alongside somebody, that, you know, we also acknowledge that they not only are the best expert in their own experience, but also the best author in their care and what recovery means for them. And so rather than us doing to somebody, we're walking alongside them along the way in their journey, not to be cliche, but we're you know, walking this walk with them, guiding them towards whatever recovery means for them. So I really think it's about just honoring that individual experience, their experience of trauma, their experience of community and their culture, all the things that they bring along with them.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. I want to get with Aaron and Sam about some other community resources. And before I do that, I want to make sure that the audience knows the crisis helpline that SJ was speaking about, where Z is a training supervisor, is open to the public 24/7. And you can call about what you are going through, or you can call because you're concerned about someone. So a lot of times with trauma, it's actually the individual's family or loved ones that are the first ones to recognize that something is wrong, that something's not the same, that despite this traumatic event happening, things aren't plateauing, they're getting worse. And we want to make sure that those of you in the audience know you can call our crisis helpline at any time about you or anyone else. And that number is 512-472-4357 or 512-472-HELP. And again, I want to emphasize you can call about yourself or anyone that you're concerned about. And it's SJ's job and their team's job to help figure out what your options are. And then you can decide what to do next. So I want to make sure to make that clear. So Aaron or Sam, what are some other places in the community a person can go outside of integral care to seek help about the impact they're experiencing from a trauma?
So the great thing about integral care is that we partner with a lot of agencies in the sense that if it exists, we can find it. So SJ talked about the helpline and sort of being really aware of our community resources who can best support individuals and their unique needs. Some that come to mind immediately is going to be, you know, the Safe Alliance, who individuals who've experienced intimate partner violence, sexual assaults. They have case management services. They have groups. They have individual therapy. They do sexual assault exams there in a very trauma-informed manner. I also think of El Buen Samaritano with their staff with bilingual counseling professionals who work with the Latinx population or Spanish speakers in our community. Think of Waterloo Counseling Center, who provides counseling to LGBTQIA+ individuals in our community. Think of the Austin Center for Grief and Loss, anyone who's experienced, or the Christie Center. Both of those work with individuals who've experienced grief and loss and the different types of grief and loss and the importance of attending a a group that speaks to the specific loss you've experienced. Those are all very unique, and they're really good about making sure that the groups that they have led by either other peers who've experienced grief or by counseling professionals, that it separates those into the groups that honors the type of loss that you've experienced. So those are the few that come into my mind when I think of community resources that our teams have referred to in the past.
I also wanted to mention mental health first aid. So Integral Care provides an amazing training that is free to the community. It is mental health first aid. So essentially, it is a training for people to learn more about signs and symptoms of common mental health disorders, as well as how to talk to loved ones, colleagues, peers, friends, if you are concerned that one of those people might be experiencing a mental health challenge. And it is a free training that we offer to the community. It is a lot of fun. It's extremely experiential. So we provide activities where we actually get to practice the language and the approach in how to have a conversation with someone that we're worried about. And the most exciting news is that we're now offering it virtually, and it is a 4-hour training where we can provide all of this information and education via Zoom. And if it's an excellent training for businesses and organizations, or even a group of family members who want to learn more about having conversations around mental wellness and how to help someone who's experiencing a mental health challenge. For anyone who is interested or would like to schedule a training, you can reach out to us at mhfa@integralcare.org.
Thank you so much, Erin. It is such an excellent training. It is accessible. It is for non-mental health professionals. It's such an amazing tool to have for the reason you just said, how you talk to someone you care about. And I know trauma is a section in that training as well. Before we move on to our next question, just want to also say that Austin Child Guidance Center is a great place if you're looking specifically for work with children, various veterans organizations in town. The Austin Asian Family Support Services Center does excellent work. And as SJ said, that crisis helpline really serves as a hub and an option. When you call into that helpline, you can click an option for referrals and resources. And SJ and their team can help hook you up with the right resource for what you are experiencing and what part of town you live in. And of course, for those of us that are lucky enough to have private insurance, private therapists, there are excellent private therapists in town who specialize in trauma as well. So next question I have, and Erin, you just hit a little bit on this, but how do you talk to someone if you're worried about them and you're worried specifically about an impact they're experiencing from trauma?
I think the very first thing to consider is to be mindful of your approach. And obviously, we're reaching out to our loved ones or people that we're worried about, probably because we're concerned and that we've already noticed that maybe there's been some changes in behavior, or we've noticed a difference in personality, or maybe we haven't even seen them because sometimes people isolate or don't reach out when they are experiencing a mental health challenge. So the very first thing I think that's so important is that we're just honest and we stay with our feelings. So using I statements, like saying something like, I feel worried about you, or I feel concerned. And then in addition to that, doing your very, very best to be empathetic, non-judgmental, and present. So picking a good time to talk, maybe where it's quiet, and allowing some time and space so that if the person that you are reaching out to does feel comfortable in sharing what's going on, or that, that they're experiencing something difficult. And then also just informing that person that they're not alone. They're not alone, and you are not alone by helping them. All of the resources that we just listed, and mental health first aid, and there's lots of support in this community to help guide these conversations and also help with getting your loved one the care that they need.
Thank you so much, Erin. And I know too that it can be really this kind of common experience when someone is confiding to you about a trauma. And like Rob mentioned earlier, there's a lot of shame wrapped up in trauma. It can take people years to disclose a traumatic event, that it's important to refrain from saying, why didn't you tell me sooner? I could have helped you. It's really important to make it about the person who's talking to you, and to remain focused on them and their experience, and being empathetic and non-judgmental. So I know that that has been helpful guidance given to me early in my career. We have about 15 minutes left for Q&A, and I have a couple queued up. Before we get to that, I wanted to look at a couple of notes that I made for organizations that we haven't yet talked about, and I cannot believe I forgot to say this organization, which is NAMI Central Texas, the National Alliance for Mental Illness of Central Texas, and that's our local chapter. They are fantastic. They have won a national award in the last couple of years, and they're an advocacy organization that supports people who have loved ones that have a mental illness. And, as we mentioned at the beginning of the forum, a lot of folks who have mental health disorders have also experienced trauma. They tend to go part and parcel. They're a wonderful organization to reach out to as well. So the first question that we have in our Q&A chat is, what can someone do, or what can I do right now to take care of myself if I've experienced a trauma?
So I can speak to that a little bit, especially when we get I think we get a lot of stuff on social media that tells us about how to do self-care right. And I think it's really important that you know what works best for you, and we utilize resources to help influence or broaden our understanding about what might work. So I think the first step when you're thinking about how to take care of yourself is pausing. I think we're with ourselves more now than we've ever been. Because of the pandemic, because of the stay-at-home orders, because of our level of crisis, we were really with ourselves. And that might put us into overwhelm and feeling like we have to be busy. But when we're present with ourselves and we take a pause and we really notice what our body is telling us, where we hold tension in our body. Does our throat close up when we feel overwhelmed? Does our shoulders lift up whenever it is that we feel stressed? Are we having stomach or gastrointestinal issues? Is our lower back hurting? Are we having more migraines than normal? And really being gentle with ourselves around the fact that our body is responding in the way that it does when we're experiencing more stress. We have more cortisol running through our body right now than ever. So really being gentle with ourselves, really being mindful, pausing and noticing it, and giving ourselves some grace that this is hard, and not to get in the space of comparative suffering, where we look at our own pain and we look at someone else's and say, well, it's not as bad as that other person's, when subjectively this might be the worst thing we have experienced in this manner, in this way. And so I think that's a really huge piece in really uncovering what self-care looks like for you.
Thank you, Sam. And SJ, I actually wanted to ask you the very same question, because I've heard you talk about this before, and I always like what you say. So what guidance would you give to someone? What can they do right now to start taking care of themselves from trauma?
Definitely, I would say being patient and compassionate with yourself, and what that could look like is a number of things, as we've kind of hit on before, but something that comes to mind right now for me is self-talk. So maybe I'm I'm struggling to get out of bed today. What's that about? Did I go to bed late? Did I eat something that is upsetting my body right now? Or am I feeling really overwhelmed and I need just a little bit more sleep? So really just being connected to yourself and knowing that it's okay to have those moments where you're not really sure on how to navigate what's happening, and kind of what next steps would be. So just really being mindful of yourself, talking to yourself, and really being connected, as Sam kind of mentioned before, and being gentle.
Thank you so much. I know that when we've talked about this before, you've said that you've heard from a lot of people that their families are saying, you're sleeping too much, get up out of bed. And your response has been, maybe they just need to sleep a little more right now. And it was such a, a simple sentence that you said, but it really impacted me that sometimes people just need to sleep a little more. And sometimes people just need to do what feels right to them, regardless of what others are thinking. I am going to hand over the rest of the questions to our Director of Communications, Ann Nagelkirk, who's been moderating the Q&A as they're coming in.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. We have 120 people, so it's so exciting that you're here. We have some great questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can. We've talked a lot about signs to look for and ways to look for help, but there's a question, how do you treat trauma?
I'll assign that question since we have no takers. Sam, let's start with you. I know that complex trauma is a specialty of yours. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Laura. Wow, if only we could have a 5-hour forum and we could all dig into this in a way that, this really, I geek out around this stuff because it's so treatable. I think, I talked about it a little bit when I talked about the most important things that I think for individuals to recognize around trauma is that it's highly treatable. Yes, the traumatic events change the brain, but that healing changes it too. And so that might look different for everyone. It may be, not all trauma eventually leads to PTSD. Individuals can experience a traumatic event and not go on to develop symptoms of PTSD as diagnosed in the DSM, right? As a diagnosable, in a diagnosable manner. And so early intervention is key. When you're noticing that trauma becomes too heavy and you're feeling overwhelmed, intervention can look like personal intervention. We're talking about those self-care things. How do you take care of yourself in a way that is much more gentle and self-compassionate? And then it might also look like communal. We have, and that was really hard during this time, during the pandemic, for a lot of us, where community is a way in which we heal. And so having to get really creative and clever around that, being able to be vulnerable enough and take that risk to share with someone else when things are getting too heavy. None of us were meant to do life alone. We were biologically wired to connect to other people. And there is something about sharing our overwhelm, our hurt, or our pain with another person who can hold it and maybe share it back and join us in it that is healing. And then there's therapy. There's a lot of different modalities out there that work with trauma, EMDR being one of them. Somatic experiencing, which focuses on the body, which I was talking about, with how it shows up for us physiologically. A lot of us don't recognize or don't know, right? And how would we if we're barely getting, kind of scraping at the surface of having these panels where we're having these difficult conversations, which shouldn't be, but we're kind of pulling the curtain back on the stigma around mental health and noticing that our bodies and having physical responses to trauma. And when we start to treat those by using those different types of modalities, whether it's talk therapy, EMDR, somatic experiencing, parts work, noticing, I think of internal family systems, and I'm naming things that are going to sound very foreign to community members, but I want you to know that there's research out there that helps guide how it is that we walk people through their traumatic experience. And we do so in a way that is slow. We do so in a way that honors the client. We do so in a way that ensures that you all are the expert on your life. And I guess the biggest piece of advice that I could give you is if you're looking for a therapist, remember that you're interviewing them. The goodness of fit is so important, and to feel really empowered to ask your maybe therapist the questions that are important to you when you come to bear, your soul, when you bear who you are to someone in a room or over video as we're doing right now.
And Anne, I would add too, there's a lot of medication therapies or pharmacological therapies that are evidence-based for PTSD, if that's something a person's interested in. So short-term use of anti-anxiety meds, medications to help you sleep. The VA really pioneered the use of a blood pressure med that overwhelmingly decreases nightmares and vivid dreams associated with trauma. So that is something that is also very well researched, and there's an array of evidence-based therapies, whether it's through talk or medications for people that want to get treatment for trauma.
And can I add something really quick too? It's one of the things that Sam had mentioned is the use of community also. And so as a veteran, I did not know until just a few years ago that organizations like a military veteran peer network exists, and that they're really kind of their main mission. And if you're a veteran like I am, you'll understand really what that brings. That term mission is to identify and connect and be available, and to create the space where healing can begin. So I was thinking about that, and I really appreciated you mentioning that.
Okay, we have another question for Erin. We talked about how to talk to people and have a conversation if you're concerned about them, but what if you need to have a conversation with your child? They can't describe their fear. How do you get to the root of their trauma when they don't have the words maybe to share?
Yeah. I am not a parent. However, working with children for a long time and parents specifically, I can empathize in how frustrating that could feel when you may not be able to communicate yet or get answers from your child in terms of what's wrong, what hurts, what feels scary, how can I help? And so, honestly, I would definitely recommend play therapy, finding maybe a therapist that engages in play therapy. It's an excellent modality that allows children to work through their trauma through play. Within our child and family division and integral care, we have therapists that are able to provide that type of therapy and work with children on a regular basis, and also teach parents tools and resources in how to continue that type of, or encourage that type of communication, because that's essentially what's happening when children engage in play. They're communicating, just not verbally. And so play therapy can also equip parents in teaching or helping them work with their child and reinforce that healing and growth and treatment.
Thank you. We are almost out of time. I've got to invite the board president of Integral Care Foundation, Rachel Gunner, to say a few words. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're going to send an email out after this with a link to the video for those who might want to share it with somebody else, as well as some resources. Some of the questions that came in, we'll be able to provide resources to answer those. So with that, I would like to welcome Rachel.
Thank you. And thank you, Anne, and thank you, Laura, and to our esteemed panelists, Robert, Erin, Samantha, SJ, and to all of you who joined us today. My name is Rachel Gunner, and it's my privilege to serve as the board president of the Integral Care Foundation that hosted this amazing forum today. What an impactful and important conversation. I myself am a therapist in the community, and I so applaud you all for all that you shared with us today. I learned so much and reinforced what I do on a daily basis. And we hope it has helped all of you build a foundation to better understand the impacts of this moment that we're all living in, and to take action to help yourselves and others. Our mental health really does depend on knowing the signs and the symptoms of trauma and how and where to get help. As Laura said early on, we recorded today's forum, and so we'll be emailing all of that information along with the resources that have been provided by all of the panelists. And at the end of the forum, there is going to be a short survey, and we hope you'll take it. So that you will give us feedback, your opinions that will only help us help you better. And finally, before we say goodbye, I'm going to repeat something Laura said early on, which is, please write this number down: 512-472-HELP, 512-472-4357. Call anytime, night or day. The professionals at Integral Care are really amazing, and they are there for you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no matter what you have to ask for, no matter what you're going through, they are there to help. So please make sure you use that number as many times as you need to. And so thank you again for joining us. We hope you continue to stay safe and healthy during these incredibly trying times, and we wish you a good rest of your afternoon.